Review code provided by Konami.
Big mistake. Big. Huge.
It finally happened. The Konami gods smiled upon me on a single day. And that day, I received a review code for the deluxe edition of Silent Hill 2 Remake, retailing for $79 American dollars and 99 American cents. Now, as some of you might already know, I'm a huge fan of the Silent Hill series. Don't worry about how I talked about them before on this channel. I love Konami and all they do these days, like hire M2 to port some of their old games, hire M2 to port some of their old games, hire M2 to port some of their old games, hire M2 to port some of their old games, or make a sequel to Super Bomberman R for some reason. A couple years ago, they pulled the ultimate chess move on Silent Hill fans. They weren't done with just firing that guy who was actually still passionate about making console games. No. They saw Capcom roaring these past 8 years with a revitalization of Resident Evil, releasing a slew of new installments and full-on remakes of their classic titles, bringing action horror back to the full front of mainstream consumption. Konami decided to reclaim the throne as horror game masters the best way they could, reintroducing Silent Hill with a remake of its sequel. Now, some of you might be wondering, why would they remake Silent Hill 2 first and not 1? Well, you big stupid morons, I'll help you understand. A few of you might say it's because they already remade the first game and called it Silent Hill Shattered Memories, but it's not true. While a new starting point for the series, it has nothing in common with the original game's design or story, besides a few homages. Konami probably doesn't even remember publishing that game. Some might assume Silent Hill 2 was the best-selling game, but that's also not true. In fact, it sold under Konami's expectations back in the early 2000s. No. You know the real reason they're remaking Silent Hill 2? Because Capcom remade Resident Evil 2 just a few years ago, and Konami's copying them. Which is smart. Why would you not simply copy the answers on the test from the way smarter students sitting next to you? We've all done that, right? And was it worth the associate's degree in psychology? I hope so. Konami also got a real titan to lead this project. Bloober Team, a studio known for Layers of Fear, a first-person horror that was inspired by an aborted Silent Hill project, and The Medium, a sleep-inducing series of escape rooms where the message of the story is if you suffer from some awful trauma and it's affecting other people, you should off yourself. What a perfect pick to remake a psychological horror game that emphasizes mental health and trauma. Another question worth asking, why remake Silent Hill 2 when it's already revered as such a masterpiece? Can't they just port the original game, maybe clean up some textures and have it run better than ever before? Well, they already tried that, and failed. So if they can't port it right, just remake it from scratch. And through a remake, there's other opportunities as well, like adding new story elements to the original experience in order to enhance it. You can rewrite certain parts of the original script that are admittedly awkward.
You're not friends with that red pyramid thing, are you?
Also, you can fully disassociate with Guy Seehee. As much as I like his original performance, let's face it, dude's a psychopath. And Konami already signed agreements for royalties and such, as far as I know. We already saw they have no problem reusing original takes from a PS2 title for their remake, so one can assume they chose not to reuse the original voice lines. This all makes financial sense, at least. Financial sense. That's what we need to keep in mind for this remake and my feelings towards it. You know what didn't make financial sense? Silent Hill 2. Well, the final product, at least. The original Silent Hill, for those that don't know, was developed by a ramshackle team of Konami grunts that couldn't get a spot at the cool kids table within the company. This losers club would be assigned to make a survival horror game similar to Resident Evil, which was ruling the roost in regards to horror in video games during the mid to late 90s. So this Konami team would draw inspiration from various movies, books, paintings, music videos, yada yada, and create Silent Hill, a game that would surprise everyone as a smashing success. The original Silent Hill was this loud, clanky, grimy horror game that bombards you with its foreboding atmosphere, army of monsters, and overall sense of danger. All while being centered on a crazy cult you're forced to deal with as your protagonist is looking for his missing daughter. As the sales and critical acclaim rolled in, the next generation of consoles was beginning to rumble for game developers, so naturally a sequel was in order and for the next generation. As the original game's director, Keiichiro Toyama, left the team shortly after its release, the rest were looking at this assignment for a sequel and thought, hey, you know how everything we put into the original game is what helped it reach such high acclaim and sales? What if we did literally none of that? Practically the only thing they have in common is sporting the same camera style, which, for what it's worth, went beyond what the original Resident Evil provided, sporting full 3D environments from beginning to end, allowing the camera to be more animated and dynamic. Even from the beginning, Silent Hill wanted to go beyond what was already established. Creative risks. So Silent Hill 2 was a regular subversion, also a creative risk. Everything I described is almost entirely absent in the sequel, and even the plot itself is completely unrelated to the original. There was no cult, no large overwhelming hordes of enemies, and any religious aspects were considerably subtle. Silent Hill 2 would be more somber, more personal, quieter, and frankly, more depressing. Even comparing our protagonists, it's just not really that heroic of a journey anymore. And despite having a pretty big marketing push, this would reflect its tepid response and low sales. Not all reviews were harsh, but many were, describing this game as a disappointment, and sales were also a fraction of what the original sold. And Konami considered the sales disappointing, considering they gave this game a much higher budget than the original. What's that saying I've heard before?
It's the kind of experimental game that'll get fawned over in 10 years.
Well, may have taken less than 10 years, but the point is that Silent Hill 2 received late respect and admiration, long after the game stopped being distributed. These days, it's considered a masterpiece and a work of art in the video game industry. It's a case of being subjectively perfect in the eyes of many, not objectively perfect. Objectively perfect doesn't exist after all. What I'm trying to say is, despite its faults, it strived in numerous other aspects, such as fantastic artistry under the limitations of 6th gen hardware, creative, mature storytelling, genuinely great acting and direction by most involved, and the strong challenge provided through its puzzles and sense of navigation. These kinds of strides are what help people look over certain aspects, such as the mediocre combat and unengaging boss fights. Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece, and probably the earliest example of me witnessing such mature storytelling in a video game. While I didn't comprehend much at the age of 15, it stuck with me as an experience, and I only grew to love it more as I got older and began analyzing stories for fun. Regardless, Konami didn't see Silent Hill 2 as this financial success at the time. That could be why Silent Hill 3 would be a more direct sequel to the original game, both in story and presentation. But back to Silent Hill 2. It became the fan favorite after a number of years, and I think it comes from two factors. One, it was designed to be easier than the original game, and sported more responsive controls. And two, the story has virtually no relevance to the original. While certain aspects can be more appreciated if you played Silent Hill 1 first, you're not going to be left confused regarding any of the characters or relevant plot elements. You still get to fully enjoy the story of James seeking solace in finding an alluring letter from his late wife. With that said, Silent Hill 2 developed a grand reputation. It's a beautiful and tragic story full of three-dimensional characters that you can't help but love and appreciate as they all work together to make a compelling story which, in a lot of ways, can only really be told in a video game. Good luck, Gans. So, let's finally get to talking about this remake. First shown in 2022, and feedback wasn't exactly the best. People were not too impressed by what was shown, and many, including yours truly, mocked the James model for looking like a fucking raisin. But besides that, witnessing the confirmation of this remake and what they showed, I only had this weird, hollow feeling. Like, I'm simply exhausted from getting mad at this franchise, even with some of their most insulting efforts. Anyway, Bloober Team and Konami clearly took some feedback to heart, most especially with the James model. And he does look better than in the first preview, and I'll always throw respect towards these kinds of decisions. It shows the parties involved at least give a quark of a shit. Nothing notable up to launch besides grifting morons complaining about character designs and showing their whole ass, proving they never played the original game. The Silent Hill 2 remake would be met with a lot of critical acclaim. Plenty of near-perfect scores, some even calling it a new horror masterpiece. This is all starting to sound a little familiar. While I had no interest in playing the game, I half-heartedly submitted my request for a key where the game was posted, confident they would reject me, but kept one eye open to see if they were naive enough. They actually didn't for a good few days after the game launched. I assume they ignored me, seeing me shit on modern Silent Hill games as well as Bloober Team with fairly popular videos, but I guess not. Now they've handed me an excuse to get mad. So let's actually talk about the remake now. I chose to play in standard difficulty as my first run, as I did with the original game my first time. It starts out innocently enough, pretty close to how the original did, which is fine. We see James take in the atmosphere as we the player are meant to take in the new supercharged 4K graphics.
This shot looked almost too good to be true here. That looks some fucking CG shit. There ain't no way that game's gonna look like that. Let me pull that up in full screen here. Actually, maybe it looks like shit.
Already from the start, we've got problems. And I've been miffed about this change since they first showed the gameplay. The third-person camera sucks. If there's a repellent of many modern game likers, it's the cinematic camera angles of yesteryear survival horror titles. Something some newer indie horror games would utilize, likely because the creators themselves still love the style. The original Silent Hill 2 used dynamic camera angles for the majority of the game, usually to show off the atmosphere they're providing in creative and unique ways. Seeing them recreate the exact same environments, but now at the level of an average man's sight, this looks boring now. And to be frank, that continues to be the case for the rest of the atmosphere they attempt to recreate, while the newer looking stuff they show off is fine. Not that I can recall anything particularly new, as well furnished as this game was from beginning to end. This change reminds me of how someone modded Silent Hill 3 to be played with a third-person camera, and the first thing I noticed looking at this footage is how the atmosphere took a complete nosedive. And that's what's happening here with the Silent Hill 2 remake, in my opinion. And for that matter, I kind of wish the camera was panned back just a little bit more. I'm not a fan of most games insisting we be at fart-sniffing proximity to our protagonist. I think Dead Rising 1 got the distance down the best. Close enough to know what you're doing, but far away enough to appreciate the atmosphere and bright vibes of the game's zombie-filled shopping mall. Anyway, the end of the dirt road shows us our first piece of new environment, some abandoned mechanic shop. While generally inoffensive, it's weird when you dissect this. Just about the entirety of the original game structure is here, with a few exceptions. Only now they took some prying tools, ripped open various parts of the original game strip, and then surgically inserted new areas. It's no longer the graveyard to the gate to the town. Now you gotta go through a mechanic shop that has a key for the gate, making it take slightly longer to actually get there. And this surgery is slathered across the remake. This is why the game takes much longer to finish. And while this isn't inherently a bad thing, the new stuff padding this experience out has to be compelling. Nobody complained that Resident Evil 1's remake added a lot of new areas and such, making the game take longer than the original because the new stuff they added was genuinely awesome and compelling. Lisa Trevor's story, which was specifically written and presented for the remake, continues to be revered as one of the best stories within the Resident Evil franchise. What's compelling about a random mechanic shop? What's compelling about going into a bunch of stores and reading a couple drab memos, or having 4 prison blocks to trudge through instead of 1? Just about all the newly written material is so uninteresting and usually only serves a new puzzle they added. And oh boy, we'll get to the puzzles later. I don't know, call me crazy, but I don't feel Silent Hill 2 has been enhanced because I read a note from a bartender at Neely's complaining about a drunk customer. Besides general supplies, which sometimes aren't there, the only other things to observe are posters that spell out the story for you in the most hackneyed sense. Admit to your guilt. Admit to your guilt. Admit to your guilt. Admit to your guilt. Gee, I wonder what the story's about. Part of me feels like they only added this stuff to make the game take a lot longer to beat the first time so they can justify the full $70 price tag, and everything added to those bits were secondary and rushed. Perhaps a byproduct of game likers' stupid obsession with how long it takes to clear a game these days. I'd be more forgiving if the new stuff added significantly to the story. First time around, me and my wife, both of us being Silent Hill veterans, ran around town for a solid hour breaking shit and looking for key items because Bloober added an extra 7 steps or whatever in order to get the apartment key. We can't help but feel like we got little to nothing regarding story and atmosphere in that extra hour of new areas and notes, or the extra hours strewn about the rest of this remade adventure. Let's start talking about the puzzles now that we've reached the first one in the remake, the jukebox. Just about all the new puzzles aren't puzzles at all. You're only required to find items and fidget with shit until you do what the game wants. This isn't engaging to me, it just feels like busy work. As for the returning puzzles, there's a couple interesting things done here, like how it pretends the coin puzzle from the apartment is even longer and more complex, adding sides to the coins. Except now the puzzle is way easier, so anyone with half a brain can finish it in under a minute. Other returning puzzles have also been reduced to fidget crap. There's so many where you can mash the solution and it'll just eventually work. This did not change throughout our run. Most of the time, the only reason we took more than a single minute to solve any of these puzzles was because we were overthinking things. In other words, we were trying to respect these as Silent Hill puzzles, which was a mistake. The game from beginning to end is pretty infantile, as not only do they make all the puzzles from the original game stupider and easier to solve, the new puzzles, all fucking 50 of them, are just matching shapes, fidgeting with shit, or reading numbers.
Wait a minute, that card.
And if the game doesn't already spell it out, James himself will. If we're to go by how cerebral and engaging these new puzzles are, the remake assumes everyone playing is a drooling moron. This got so bad, I started replaying the game with the hard puzzle difficulty before we even finished our normal run, and they're barely different, and most are just as effortless. Some even have the same exact solution, which is really stupid, especially with easy stuff like the keypad solutions. The original game had variations that, as far as I know, don't exist in the run until you reach the answer. In other words, it doesn't let you input the code before you know it. Bloober did not bother doing this. Often their way of making puzzles harder is really dumb shit, like rearranging where the answer is or just making it a different number you're supposed to guess in the first place. Changing difficulty also left certain puzzles unchanged. I guess the jukebox isn't a puzzle according to this difficulty setting, so what do I call it? A fidget toy, I guess. That's all it really is. A fidget toy to make you feel like you're solving something.
Oh, good job. You're a good little boy.
On the opposite side of this coin, there's the combat. Bloober Team were so proud of how much they changed the combat that they made a whole combat trailer, something people actually made fun of for a while. I'm not one to excuse the combat in the original game. It's not great, but it was easy, it was serviceable, and it made for an obstacle you need to overcome. They also let you have some sense of power and fun through its stronger weapons. To be frank, I always assumed the original game's combat was made out of obligation. Quote-unquote walking simulators weren't much of a thing back then, especially not on consoles. They certainly existed, but no real mainstream company that focused on console games was tackling something like that back in 2001. Not to say the monsters don't add anything to Silent Hill 2's story and world, they do. I just always assumed the combat was not something they prioritized regarding the game's design. Silent Hill 3 and 4 would improve this aspect in various ways though. I never felt the experience would see any real improvement if the combat was a bit more engaging, but clearly Bloober disagreed. Just what the story needed. Just what the mainline Silent Hill game with the smallest enemy variety needed. High octane combat. Unsurprisingly, it now feels closer to something like The Last of Us, even the way James and the enemies sort of magnetize into each other when throwing out attacks. And Bloober was so proud of this, they put enemies fucking everywhere, and it is so annoying. They also have really irritating habits and think they're ninjas half the time, making them even more frustrating to deal with, especially with how inconsistent some of these mechanics can be. Usually the only reason I take any damage is because the fights are boring and I get impatient. I'm not saying it isn't my fault, it's just that they make me fight so much and the enemies have annoying patterns and bullshit, like how melee attacks rarely stun them. Most of the time, it's just a couple attacks and then a dodge. There's even dodge cancels and iframes, which is bizarre, but it's not like Silent Hill 4 didn't have fighting strats. There's a point where I had to fight 5 mannequins in a row, and that's when I started questioning who thought this was a good idea. Because while the original game doesn't have great combat, at least they didn't force you into so many fights. If the original game had this many fights and this many monster encounters, it would have made a much worse experience. The boss fights were mostly fine. There was definitely more effort put into it than the original. It's just kind of strange how action-packed and arcadey they feel, considering Silent Hill 2's story and atmosphere. The whole combat aspect is just jarring to me. I'm not saying the fights shouldn't feel fun, I'm saying they don't feel fun. I feared every encounter, not for general fright, but because I knew the next handful of seconds was going to be really, really annoying. Because I can't find any other place to put this, exploring and running around town is also kind of shitty. I already talked about the visuals and artistry being less interesting, but things are only more boring as the entire game is riddled with other actions like crawling under shit, moving shit on wheels, and shimmying through holes. You know what other game did this bullshit and mind-numbing busy work? Silent Hill Homecoming, literally the worst game in the franchise. There's actually a lot of instances where they were clearly taking elements from the lesser Silent Hill games, but this one stuck out the most. They can't even respect the player enough with some of these stupid obstacles. The second you get these wheeled boxes in the right place, it literally locks in automatically. They think you're so stupid that you can't be trusted with such a simple device. Why have us even push it around in the first place if you're not going to do anything even remotely creative with it? I know why they put this dumb shit in here though. They make the player feel more involved, and I guess more engaged with the experience. Never works for me though. All these boxes, these breakable walls, and these crawl spaces look exactly the same everywhere, so all I see is really shitty map design. Your means to get around feels so obtuse now, which adds to why it takes forever to clear any of these worlds, even if you're doing everything right. The fact that the speedrunner achievement is to beat it in under 10 hours is flabbergasting. Oh boy, I haven't even talked about the story, huh? I will say a lot of the rewritten dialogue is better.
Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. A dead person can't write a letter.
Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
The original script wasn't perfect, it wasn't the best, so I can see why some bits of dialogue were changed, if not outright removed. With that said, it's kind of funny how most of the new stuff was unimpressive. I did like the new cutscene between James and Maria in Heaven's Night, making it feel more like the pit stop that it is. We get a small glimpse of James as a character that was told, not shown before. Now it is shown with some subtlety. In the original game, there was an inner monologue that was easily missed where James talks about his alcoholism for a bit. Now, well, there are no inner monologues, which is, The new scene has him reject a drink Maria offered, but you can tell from the way his eyes and face are animated that he's having a hard time. This conveys that he had a drinking problem. Nice job, guys! You got a gold star! There you go. There's one other new scene between him and Angela, and it's put in such a bad place and beats you over the head with the game's themes, I don't even want to get into that. And that in itself is sort of my problem with a lot of the new material. It takes the themes of the original and just pummels you with visuals and random signage, but the real detriment here is the cutscene direction. You'd think since the work was already done for this aspect, they wouldn't fuck it up. But no, all the nuanced stuff like the lighting and shading is just completely gone. I only recently learned there were some good effects and color choices in the 1.0 version, but once the game launched at 1.03, they took a lot of it out. Amazing. It's like Bloober gave themselves the HD collection treatment, and the body language is terrible. Most of the time, the characters are just standing still and talking. I know it sounds like nitpicking, but I think it's a pretty big deal. Back in the original game, all the characters in their scenes, especially those animated by Takayoshi Sato's team, had so much body language. I can only assume this is because the games were still only designed for CRT televisions at the time. So they couldn't really animate their faces that much, at least not in a realistic sense. So using body language made it more clear how they're feeling and what they're expressing. And that in itself is thanks to whomever directed the actors during motion capture recording sessions. They probably had to tell them to really let their movements be expressive. Was it a little awkward sometimes? Sure, but I think it worked extremely well for the characters and their emotions. The new director probably didn't direct their bodies very much and had them emphasize how their faces looked as they were mocapping the cutscenes. Perhaps they just wanted to emphasize on facial expressions. That definitely explains the original James model, but there's a lot of things that are just not conveyed well or look really awkward. James especially stands stiff in just about every single scene, and I don't take it as a he's awkward, maladjusted or something, but that they just didn't feel like animating him much, or even other characters for that matter. I know this specific shot of Eddie was clowned on for looking awful. I really don't like how they changed some of these scenes, the most notable being Maria's death scene in the hospital. Actually, let's get sidetracked because this was specifically a horrible recreation. The original had you just walking through the thin hallway and things are hunky-dory. But then all of a sudden, you notice Pyramid Head walking behind you like, oh shit! One of the many advantages of a dynamic camera angle. No entrance, no cutscene, it's panic-inducing. But now he gets to come in like the big bad because the game wants to treat him like Jason Voorhees. That explains his jump scare before too. What's really stupid is Maria runs faster than you in-game. She's ahead of James the entire time. There's no way you can get ahead of her. But once the cutscene snaps in, she's suddenly tailing behind. Such a terrible design that harms the story, in my opinion. Back to the cutscene itself. The original was very emotional. You can see and hear the panic and desperation between the characters as the doors refuse to budge. Maria trying to jam herself in, James trying to force the doors open, the camera's all shaky, adding to that panic feeling, and cuts to these close-ups. James even tries mashing the button, and as she screams his name out, it is such a harrowing part of the game, and it really sells that with everything it's doing. As the scene goes quiet and James sinks to the floor, that heart-wrenching piano comes in. It's so fucking good. In the remake, it's lacking pretty much all of that, and they're just not saying anything, and making the Jason comparison again. This looks like a kill from Friday the 13th. They even have blood spatter on them. It just feels tasteless now. Like they're trying to sell a gnarly kill instead of the actual emotion we're supposed to be feeling. No, you don't earn the piano. Fuck off. Lacking a lot of body language, the characters feel less alive and less real to me. And the whole thing is further marred by the voice acting, which their execution was nothing if not sporadic. The new James sounds much closer to Troy Baker's performance in the HD port, which I was not a fan of, but he's definitely better than Baker.
I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.
I understand not wanting to replicate Sihi from the original, but I don't know. Sometimes it sounds appropriate, other times he just sounds really breathy and weird. Eddie and Angela are fine. Eddie actually sounds closer to the original performance than I expected. He's good. Looks as gross as I imagined, too.
Well, they came at me. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. I came here. Figured it might be safe, but then I found the guy in the fridge.
Easy, deep breaths.
For Angela, they clearly went a different direction with how she speaks, but the actor did a fine job still portraying her as this damaged person who has a hard time communicating with others.
So all you know is that she lived in this town?
What did you say? How did you know that?
Well, I just figured because this is where you're looking for her. How else would I know?
Yeah. Sorry.
Laura was fine too, certainly sounds a little less hammy than the original, which I thought was a good change. The actor that voiced Mary and Maria though, pretty bad.
I don't look like a ghost, do I?
Probably the worst of the bunch. Except some side characters.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in.
There's no differentiating the way she speaks between the two characters, and there's zero emotion in just about all of her line readings.
You're just gonna leave me here? Alone? With all these monsters around?
No, I just...
Is it because I remind you of her?
It sucks because Monica Taylor Horrigan's performance in the original was phenomenal. She sold the light airiness of Mary and the more grounded, confrontational sass of Maria. Do I even need to play examples of her Mary near the end? It's still heartbreaking to listen to even today. The story itself on paper is mostly fine. everything still starts and ends pretty much the same way. I imagine Bloober didn't have a lot of wiggle room to change things, but this is something worth considering. There's almost nothing new regarding the actual story, yet this remake is arguably double the length of the original. What more needs to be said? The pace of the story has been dragged to a crawl. What probably took the biggest blow was the atmosphere. I already talked about how third person just sort of makes everything look the same and restricts how they're able to convey certain moods and the environment itself. It's also why the remake needs prompts, as most things don't stick out enough, most certainly shelves and drawers you can open. That in itself is already an annoying mechanic they just took from The Last of Us, probably. And picking up items itself can be a chore sometimes. Standing in front of them simply isn't good enough. Of course, there's other changes that just completely ruin what was conveyed in the original game. Silent Hill 2 takes the most somber turn after Maria dies in the hospital, right? As you're led to trekking across the town in the middle of the night, there's no electricity, oddly realistic for that moment, so the only source of light is your own flashlight. It's not only a haunting part of the game, but also incredibly lonesome. In the remake, the same thing generally happens, except now it looks more like the other world from Silent Hill 1, building and roads torn apart and some lights are working. It's loud, busy, and there's slews of enemies on your very, very linear path. And as I was playing this the first time, there was something I couldn't quite pick at that was bothering me until I sat there and thought about it, looking at the new environment. This doesn't look like an abandoned town anymore. It looks like a movie set. It looks fake. It does not portray the dark, sad loneliness that James should be feeling. That's actually a problem I have with the overall design of this remake. The original Silent Hill 2 challenged your sense of navigation more than anything else, much like the first game. You had to run and trudge through these giant empty streets, and through updates on the map, you decipher where you can go to find even a crumb of progress. And the main worlds being the apartment complex, the hospital, the dungeons beneath the historical society, and the hotel are these large labyrinths that require you to hunt every nook and cranny. Hey, those doors are unmarked. I haven't tried them yet. Let's take a look. There could be a key or perhaps healing items I need. What I'm saying is the original game didn't have a problem letting you explore and even go dizzy running in circles because you missed that one room or that one key. I'm sure these days a lot of people would complain about that, but I don't believe it's a stretch to say that was the point of playing it. You're supposed to feel lost and alone, which I think the game succeeds throughout most of it, with only an escort mission to emphasize that loneliness even more after they take that away from you. The remake, on the other hand, railroads you throughout a lot of its own obstacles, puzzles, and maps. Getting lost just doesn't happen as often, and the game even has the audacity to lock away where you came from because they don't trust that you'll solve the immediate puzzle in front of you, or the game is just saying, okay, there's nothing left to find back there, good job! Baby shit. Let me get lost. Let me make my own decisions. And it's so pathetic how often key items are literally placed right next to where they need to go. Are some parts of the story in the remake better? Technically speaking, sure. Some of the dialogue sounds more natural, certain deliveries and executions are better, but if I could trade that for better body language, better atmosphere, better puzzles, and less annoying gameplay, well, I can, because I have the original game. This remake served as a heavy reminder of how important the original game's atmosphere was to the experience. This isn't a movie. The cutscenes alone do not sell the Silent Hill 2 experience. Looking at the gameplay objectively, it was nothing special. What really pushed Silent Hill 2 over the edge was the environment, the music, the map design, the direction, and the atmosphere. everything worked so well together, forming this memorable experience. The remake fucks up so much of that while adding little of value to the story and ruining most of the cutscenes. I didn't even talk about how a lot of the new music stinks too. It's weird how Yamaoka by name alone tends to get a pass from people. He composed some incredible music throughout his career. But these days, I feel like he lacks any spirit in his work, and he fucked up reinterpreting some of his own music. Some might call it unfair how I'm constantly comparing this remake to the original, that I should judge it by its own merits, that it isn't fair that I keep bringing up the original Silent Hill 2. Well, you know what? Maybe the fucking remake itself shouldn't be doing that either. These stupid Easter eggs lying around everywhere going, huh? Remember that part of the original? Hey, remember this thing from the original? Isn't that cool? Yes, Bloober, I remember the original coin puzzle being challenging, thank you. I will admit though, I'm not sure if this was their intent, but if they're implying some sort of time loop thing is going on with James, like this is his own personal hell, that's alright. There's even parts where I can tell that the only reason they're in this remake is because they were in the original game. That refrigerator scene didn't just exist for like a cute little exchange. That scene was there because James can run into that room before he finds Maria, but the story needs you to have Maria with you before you make progress with that item. In the remake, there's no way to get to that room before finding her. So why is it here? Because they can't stop reminding us of the original game. So excuse me if I keep thinking about that. The original Silent Hill 2 was going against its own grain. Those nut bars at Team Silent took creative risks to provide something they felt they needed to express. They made clear decisions and intent that they didn't want to do the same trick twice. All the decisions that made Silent Hill 2 what it is, and not like Silent Hill 1, wasn't for the sole intent to sell copies. They took creative risks that would end up turning that game into a bona fide classic, even if it didn't sell that well. If that isn't art in the video game industry, I don't know what is. Silent Hill 2's remake made the puzzles mostly effortless. That is not a creative risk. They aped The Last of Us' combat. That is not a creative risk. The camera is now third person, making it barely distinguishable to dozens of other games released in the past 5 years. That is not a creative risk. They did all these things because that's what sells. These decisions were only made for financial gain. In other words, like many remakes, the remake of Silent Hill 2 is anti-art. But that's not to say literally every ounce of the game is anti-art, or that the devs involved are not creative people. I'm sure there are plenty of good artists and such behind this game, but the sum of this entire effort, this product, this title as it was released on storefronts, is anti-art. No judgment on the individuals involved, I just can't respect this remake for even a second, especially with my beliefs of video games as an art form and preservation. The only conversation I have any interest in is who made these decisions. I don't think it was Bloober Team. As awful as I think their products are, it's really weird seeing their last original game before this was The Medium, which not only lacked combat, but sported dynamic camera angles throughout, similar to classic survival horror. I'm not one to believe it was their decision to ape action combat games and make the entire experience strictly third person. This was probably just Konami meddling because they want to shamelessly rip off more successful games, and it's annoying to see them get rewarded for that. This whole experience wasn't bad though. I played through the entire remake alongside my wife, and she has some old, bad memories that were associated with Silent Hill. I won't go into great detail, but she already had this deep fondness for the original 4 games. It's just that these bad memories that would come in later tend to creep up and associate with her adoration for those games. As mediocre and underwhelming this remake was, it's helping her make new memories associated with Silent Hill. This time with someone that deeply loves and cares about her. Someone who's going to keep making good memories with her and sharing hobbies for years to come. So, for that, thanks Bloober, and thanks Konami. It wasn't all bad. One last thing to mention, I guess. Some might notice the title of this review, In Here is a Tragedy. Some might be like, hey, that line's from a puzzle in Silent Hill 3. Why would you use that for a Silent Hill 2 review? Well, Konami clearly doesn't give a shit. Why should I?